The conference room in the Licking County Courthouse smelled like old paper and central heating that had been running since October. I sat at the far end of the table, and across from me, Preston Whitfield had a folder open and his pen already uncapped, as if the signing were a formality we were all just waiting to complete. He was 41 years old, wore a suit that cost more than my first car, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything, or so he believed. Gloria sat beside him, her hands folded, wearing the expression she always wore in rooms like this: composed, patient, certain. I had not said a word since I walked in. I counted the chairs around the table. There were 8. I had been in that building once before, 22 years ago, when Ruth and I updated our estate documents after she was diagnosed the first time. She had squeezed my hand in the parking lot afterward and said, "Well, that's done." I thought about that on the drive over. I thought about it again now, watching Preston straighten his folder the way a man does when he wants to look prepared but is actually waiting to see what the other side will do. I had 2 years of what the other side would do. He didn't know that yet. Before Diane arrived, I set a folder on the table. It was thicker than his, considerably thicker, and I placed it squarely in the center of my side, said nothing, and watched him notice it. He looked at it for 2 seconds, then looked away. That was the last moment he was certain of anything. I want to tell you how we got there. I retired in March, 31 years after I took my first job as a structural engineer. What that work teaches you, if you do it long enough, is that everything fails eventually, but only if you don't account for the variables. You account for the variables. You build in the margin. You wait. I moved back full-time to the house Ruth and I had built in Westerville in 1989, a 4-bedroom colonial on Ashford Lane, on a lot we had chosen ourselves on a Saturday morning in late spring when the ground was still soft. Ruth had wanted a kitchen that faced east. We raised Nora there, and when Ruth died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, I stayed. The house was paid off. I had a pension and no debt. It was a quiet life. Preston came into Nora's life about 3 years before that morning in the courthouse. She had met him at a conference in Cincinnati. He was a real estate attorney. She was in commercial property management, and I understood from the beginning why she found him compelling. He was articulate and attentive and knew how to be interested in what other people were saying. The first time I met him, he asked me about the I-270 project with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and we talked for 40 minutes about soil displacement and bridge deck construction. He had done his homework. I noticed that. I filed it away without deciding what it meant. For the first year, I had no serious concerns. He treated Nora well, or appeared to. He called me on my birthday. When I mentioned that the gutters on the east side needed replacing, he offered to come over the following weekend with a ladder. He did not come, but the offer was made warmly. He was the kind of man who made offers warmly. It was in the second year that things began to shift, and they shifted so gradually that I think Nora did not notice the direction of travel until she was already far from where she had started. The first conversation that stayed with me happened at Nora's house in November, a dinner she had organized, just the 4 of us, Nora, Preston, Gloria, and me. Gloria Whitfield was a woman of 67 who had spent her career in financial consulting and had the habit of framing every opinion as concern. She was not unkind to me that evening. She was something more difficult than unkind. She was solicitous. She asked about my health. She asked whether I found the house too large now that I was alone. She asked whether I had considered what would happen if I had a fall or a health event, and there was no one nearby. I told her I was in good health and that my neighbor Carol had a key. Gloria nodded as though I had confirmed something she already suspected. Then she said, "Martin, Preston could help you manage things more efficiently. You've been carrying everything alone for too long. No one should have to do that at your age." I drank my coffee. It had gone slightly cold. I drank it anyway. 2 weeks later, Preston sent me an email. The subject line was "Simplified Asset Transfer Worth a Conversation." In the body, He explained that transferring the Ashford Lane property into joint ownership, his name and Nora's, would streamline estate administration and protect the asset from probate delays. He used the word streamline twice and the word protection 4 times. The email was 3 paragraphs long and had been written carefully. I read it 3 times. Then I called Diane Okafor. I had known Diane since 2003 when she handled a contract dispute on a highway project I was overseeing near Dublin. She was meticulous and unhurried, and had the quality I most valued in anyone she listened before she spoke. When I read her the email over the phone, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't sign anything. Don't respond to the email. Come in Thursday." I told her I'd be there at 9. I did not tell Nora about the call. The December dinner was at Gloria's house in Bexley, a large Tudor on a corner lot that had been in the Whitfield family for 30 years. There were 6 of us: Martin, Nora, Preston, Gloria, and Preston's sister Heather and her husband. It was a pleasant evening until it wasn't. We were finishing the main course when Gloria set down her fork and looked at me with the expression of a woman who had decided to say something she had been rehearsing. She said, "I want to be honest, because I think honesty is what this family needs. Martin, you're a good man, but the reality is you don't have the connections or the resources or the influence to give Nora what she needs going forward. You've done what you could, but she needs people around her who can actually move things forward for her." She paused. I don't say that to be hurtful. I say it because it's true. The table was quiet. Heather looked at her plate. Preston looked at Gloria with an expression I could not read, not disagreement, not approval, something in between. I looked at Nora. She was looking at her hands. I said nothing. I picked up my glass of water and took a drink. Then I asked Heather how her children were doing, and she told me, and the conversation moved on. On the drive home, I passed the on-ramp to I-270 northbound. I had walked that ground in 1994 with a surveying crew in February when the temperature was 11 degrees. We had built something that was still standing. I thought about load tolerances. I thought about margin. I thought about the difference between a man who has nothing left to give and a man who has simply chosen not to show his hand. There is a difference. I knew which one I was. I just needed 2 years to prove it. She came on a Saturday morning in January, which is the worst kind of morning for an unwanted visitor. Gray sky, no wind, the kind of cold that makes everything feel permanent. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when I saw Gloria Whitfield's Mercedes turn into the driveway. I didn't move. I watched her park, straighten her coat in the reflection of the car window, and walk to the front door carrying a large manila envelope under one arm. She rang the bell once. I opened the door. She said, "Martin, I hope this isn't a bad time." She said it the way people do when they have already decided it isn't. I told her to come in. She stood in the entryway and looked at the house the way a contractor looks at a property before giving an estimate, not rudely, but with a kind of quiet calculation that she didn't bother to hide. The ceilings, the floors, the staircase Ruth had insisted on refinishing in 2003 because she said the original oak deserved better than what 30 years of foot traffic had done to it. Gloria Whitfield took all of it in and then smiled at me, and I showed her into the living room. She set the envelope on the coffee table. She said, "I wanted to bring this in person. Preston thought I should call first, but I told him that some conversations are better face to face." I sat down. I waited. She opened the envelope and slid out a document roughly 20 pages long, bound with a black clip. She set it in front of me. At the top of the first page, in 12-point type, it read, "Revocable Living Trust Agreement, Callaway Family Property." Below that, in the beneficiary line, 2 names, Preston Whitfield and Nora Whitfield, née Callaway. I picked it up. I read it, all of it. Gloria sat across from me and did not rush me, which I noticed. She had the patience of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. When I finished, I set it back on the table. She said, "The house is too big for one person. Martin, Ruth is gone. That's a fact, and no one is trying to be unkind about it. It's simply true. Nora and Preston could use this space. They could raise a family here, and you'd be taken care of. The trust provides for that. There's a residency clause on page 11. You'd have the right to stay as long as you needed. She paused. You wouldn't have to manage any of it anymore. That's not nothing. At 64. Her voice was even. That was the part I would remember most clearly afterward, not the words, but the register. She wasn't threatening me. She was explaining things. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are certain the other person will eventually come around, and they are simply saving everyone time by arriving at the conclusion first. I looked past her, toward the kitchen. The table was visible through the doorway, the one Ruth and I had bought in 1991 at an estate sale in Bethesda. Walnut top, 2 leaves, 4 chairs. One of the chairs still had a faint gray mark on the back rail where Nora had pressed too hard with a pencil in 3rd grade, doing homework she'd brought to the kitchen because she didn't want to sit alone upstairs. I had never sanded it out. Ruth hadn't either. I looked at that mark for a moment. Then I picked up the Revocable Living Trust, aligned the pages carefully, and slid it back into the envelope. I held it out to Gloria. I said, "Thank you for coming by." She looked at the envelope, then at me. Something shifted in her expression. Not anger, not yet. More like recalibration. She took the envelope. She said, "Martin, I hope you'll think about it seriously. This is a practical conversation, not a personal one." I said, "I understand." She left. I stood at the front door and watched the Mercedes back down the driveway and turn onto the street. The brake lights flared once at the corner, and then she was gone. I went back to the kitchen. I sat in the same chair I'd been sitting in when she arrived. My coffee was cold. I drank it anyway. 3 weeks later, Nora called to say she and Preston were having dinner at the house on Sunday. Just a small thing. She said, "A few people from Preston's office." She asked if I wanted to come. I said I did. She gave me the time. I arrived at 6:30. There were 4 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize, and when I rang the bell, Preston opened the door. He was holding a glass of wine and wearing the expression of a man who has already decided how a conversation will go. He looked at me and said pleasantly, "Martin, we didn't think you'd make the drive in this weather." Behind him, I could see the entry hall coats on the rack. Voices from the dining room. A woman I didn't know setting something on the sideboard. He said, "We're actually a little tight on seats tonight. I should have been clearer with Nora." He smiled. He said, "I appreciate you coming all this way." I looked past him once. Nora was not in the entry hall. I said, "Of course. Tell her I said hello." I turned and walked back to my car. One of Preston's colleagues, a man in his 40s who had been standing near the window, watched me go. I saw him in the glass of the front door as I stepped off the porch. He looked at Preston. Preston had already turned back toward the dining room. I drove home. I did not call Nora that night. I added the date, the time, and what Preston had said, word for word, to the engineering notebook on my desk. I noted the colleague at the window. I noted that Preston had used the word "we" 3 times in 4 sentences. That afternoon, I called Diane Okafor. She had been my attorney for 11 years, since the contract dispute with the county over the Millbrook Road easement, and she had a particular quality I had always valued. She listened before she spoke, and when she spoke, she did not waste words. I read her the relevant sections of the document from memory. I had been an engineer for 37 years, and I had learned early that you read a document once, and you remember what matters. When I finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Martin, they hired someone to draft this. A living trust that specific, with those beneficiary designations and that residency clause. That's not something you pull from a template. That took time and money." I said I knew. She said, "Which means they planned this before they came to see you." I said I knew that too. Another silence. Then Diane said, "How long do you want to give them before we respond?" I looked out of the kitchen window. The yard was bare. The maple Ruth had planted in 1998, standing gray and empty against the January sky. In spring, it would come back. It always did. I told Diane I wasn't ready to respond yet. I told her I wanted to understand the full shape of what they were doing before I moved. She said she would start pulling records. I said that was fine. I said to start with the property filings for the last 18 months. She said she would call me Thursday. I hung up and sat at the table for a long time. They planned this before they came. I had already known the document was too clean, too specific, the residency clause too carefully worded to be anything other than premeditated. But hearing Diane say it made it concrete in a different way. This was not impulsiveness. This was architecture. I had spent 37 years building things that were meant to hold weight. I knew the difference between a structure and a facade. I knew which one collapsed first under pressure. I picked up my cup, carried it to the sink, and rinsed it. Then I went to my office and opened the filing cabinet where I kept the original deed to the house. I read it once. I put it back. I had time. The isolation didn't happen all at once. That was the part I hadn't anticipated, not the fact of it, but the pace. It came in layers, the way water damage comes slowly, then everywhere. The first sign was Carol Estes. She lives next door, has for 19 years, and she is not a woman who holds her tongue when she has something to say. She called me on a Tuesday morning in October, about 6 weeks after Gloria and Preston's visit, and she said, "Martin, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it somewhere else." I told her to go ahead. She said that at the previous Sunday's service at First Methodist, the church Ruth and I had attended for 22 years, the church where Ruth's funeral was held, Gloria Whitfield had told 3 women in the fellowship hall that I was having memory issues, that I'd left the stove on twice, that the family was worried, that they were hoping I'd consider some kind of assisted living arrangement before something happened. I thanked Carol. She said, "I told them it was nonsense." I told her I appreciated that. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The chair across from me was the one Ruth had always used. I looked at it and thought about the specific kind of cruelty that uses concern as its instrument. It leaves no marks. It sounds, to anyone listening, like love. The second layer came 2 weeks later. Margaret Osei, a woman Ruth had known since they were both in their 30s. A woman who had called every birthday and every anniversary for as long as I could remember, stopped calling. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that's been present so long you only register it by its absence. I didn't reach out. I already knew why. Gloria had been to see her. I didn't know what had been said, but I knew the shape of it. Martin is struggling. We're concerned. The family is trying to handle it quietly. That was all it would take. Margaret was a kind woman. Kind people are the easiest to redirect. By the end of November, I had a list, 11 weeks of names, dates, and what I'd been told or could reasonably reconstruct. The pastor at First Methodist, 2 of Ruth's friends from her garden club, the couple across the street who had waved to me every morning for a decade and had recently stopped. I wrote it all down in the same engineering notebook I'd used for site measurements, narrow-ruled, green cover, the kind I'd bought by the dozen for 37 years. I wrote in the same handwriting I used for load calculations, precise, no editorializing. Nora called on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of November. It was 7:14. I remember because I had just turned off the television and the timestamp was still on the screen when the phone rang. Her voice was careful in a way that her voice had not always been careful with me measured, slightly flat, the way a person sounds when they are reading from something they rehearsed. She said, "Dad, Preston and I have been talking, and we think you should consider moving to a senior living community. The house is a lot of maintenance, and we worry about you managing it alone." I let the sentence finish. Then I said, "Is that what you think? Or is that what Preston thinks?" There were 4 seconds of silence. I counted them. Then she said, "We both think it." I said, "All right." I didn't say anything else. Neither did she. For a moment. Then she said she'd send me some information, and I said that would be fine, and we said goodnight. I put the phone down and looked at the engineering notebook on the desk. I added the date, the time, and what she had said, word for word, as accurately as I could reconstruct it. I noted the 4-second pause. I noted the phrasing "we both think it," not "I think it," not "I've been worried." I noted that she had not asked how I was. The following Thursday, I drove to Diane's office. It was my 3rd meeting with her that month. I brought the notebook. She read through it without speaking. She turned pages slowly, the way someone reads when they are looking for something specific and finding more than they expected. When she set it down, she looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "You've been documenting this since before our first meeting." I said, "Since about 3 weeks after Preston and Gloria came to the house." She said, 11 weeks. 11 weeks. She looked at the notebook again, then back at me. She said, "You were preparing for this before you knew what this was." I told her I was a civil engineer for 37 years. I said, "I measure before I cut." She picked up her pen. She said, "All right, then let's talk about what you're building." What I was building had 4 components, and I had been assembling them in the order that made structural sense. The first was the house, the deed, the title history, the original mortgage paid off in 2009, the property tax records going back to 1986. The second was Ruth's estate documents, her will, the amendment she'd signed 18 months before she died, the letter she'd written to be included with it. The third was a record of every contact Gloria had made with members of our community, the notebook, now 31 pages. The fourth was the one no one knew about. 8 months before I retired, I signed a consulting contract for a bridge rehabilitation project in the eastern part of the state, a project I'd spent 2 years developing the structural assessment for, and which the county had finally funded. The contract was for technical oversight during construction. The fee was $340,000 paid in 2 installments, the second of which cleared 14 months ago. I had put it in a separate account at a different institution, not out of any premeditated strategy, but because Ruth and I had always kept our consulting income separate from household accounts. It was a habit from the early years when project payments were irregular and we didn't want the uncertainty touching the mortgage. No one in the family knew the account existed. Preston had never asked about consulting income. Gloria had built her entire case on the premise that I was an aging man on a fixed pension with a house I couldn't maintain and nothing left to offer. She had been thorough. She had simply measured the wrong things. I told Diane about the account. I gave her the institution name and the account number. I watched her write it down. She set her pen on the desk and looked at it for a moment. She said, "They don't know." I said, "No." She said, "Good. Don't tell anyone." I told her I hadn't told anyone in 14 months. She said that was exactly right. Then she opened a new folder and wrote my name on the tab. And we began. The call came on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone lit up on the counter, Carol Estes. The name read, the way it had read dozens of times over 19 years. I picked up on the second ring. She said she'd been watching from her front window around 8 that morning when she noticed a man she didn't recognize standing on the sidewalk in front of my house. He had a clipboard and a camera. He was photographing the exterior from multiple angles, the roofline, the foundation, the garage, the back corner where the oak tree had grown into the fence line. Carol had gone outside to ask him directly. She was 71 years old and had lived on Millbrook Road since before Nora was born. And she did not find strangers with clipboards to be a normal occurrence. The man told her he was a property assessor. She asked who had authorized the assessment. He didn't answer. He walked to his car and drove away. She said, "I wrote down his plate number. Martin, I thought you should know." I thanked her. I told her she had done exactly the right thing. After I hung up, I stood at the counter for a moment. Then I carried my coffee to the kitchen table and sat down in the chair by the window, Ruth's chair, the one she used every morning with whatever novel she was working through, always with her feet tucked under her and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. The chair still sat at the same angle she had preferred, facing the back garden. I had never moved it. I sat there and I thought about what a property assessor with a clipboard meant. I already knew, but I needed a moment to let the knowing settle before I picked up the phone again. I called the main office of Alderman and Cole Property Services. Which was the largest residential assessment firm operating in the county? A woman answered. I gave her my address on Millbrook Road and asked whether any assessment had been ordered for the property in the past 30 days. She put me on hold. I counted the seconds. I got to 412 before she came back. Her name was Sandra. She said carefully that there was an assessment on file for the Millbrook Road address, commissioned approximately 3 weeks prior. She said it was standard practice to require written authorization from the property owner before conducting any on-site work. Then she paused, and I could hear something shift in her voice, a small recalibration, the kind that happens when a person realizes they may have said something they shouldn't have. She said, the gentleman who commissioned the assessment indicated that he was a co-owner of the property. I said, he is not. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Sir, I think you may want to speak with our office manager. I told her that wouldn't be necessary. I already had what I needed. I thanked her and ended the call. If you've ever had someone tell you that a stranger has been measuring your home without your knowledge, photographing the walls your wife helped you choose the paint for, the foundation you poured yourself in the summer of 1989, the garden she planted and you maintained for 30 years after she was gone, then you understand that what I felt sitting in that kitchen was not panic. It was something colder and more precise. It was the feeling of a man who has suspected something for a long time finally receiving confirmation that his suspicions were correct. I called Diane. She answered on the first ring. I told her about Carol's call, about Sandra at Alderman and Cole, about the 3-week timeline. I told her Preston had identified himself as a co-owner of a property to which he held no legal claim whatsoever. Diane was quiet for exactly the length of time it took her to process what I'd said. Then she said, This tells us where they are in the timeline. They're preparing to file. They'll petition the court for a transfer of ownership, most likely on the grounds of diminished capacity, that you're unable to manage the asset responsibly. The assessment gives them a current valuation to attach to the petition. I asked whether they had enough to make that argument credibly. She said, Not yet. They'll try to manufacture evidence, financial records pulled out of context, a doctor's note they'll misrepresent, testimony from people who've seen you on a bad day. They'll build a picture. I said, Then we need real evidence, the kind that doesn't require manufacturing. She said, We have some of it already. After today, we have more. I heard her writing. The co-owner claimed to the assessment company. That's a material misrepresentation, possibly fraud, depending on what they do with the report. She paused. Martin, don't change your routine. Don't call Preston. Don't mention any of this to Nora yet. Let them file. We want them on record. I told her I understood. After I hung up, I sat in Ruth's chair a while longer. The back garden was gray in the November light, the oak tree bare now, the flower beds my wife had designed turned over for winter. I had maintained those beds every year since she died, not because I particularly enjoyed gardening, but because she had drawn the layout herself on a piece of graph paper that I still kept in the top drawer of my desk. The house was worth considerably more than Preston Whitfield knew, not in the way he was measuring it. I finished my coffee. Then I went to my desk and opened the folder Diane and I had started 14 months ago, and I added a new page. At the top, I wrote the date, the name of the assessment company, and the name Sandra had given me for the assessor on file. Below that, I wrote Preston Whitfield co-owner claim, unverified, no legal basis. I underlined the last 4 words. The certified mail arrived on a Monday. Gerald, he'd been running this route for 14 years, and I knew his schedule the way I knew the sound of the furnace clicking on in November came up the front walk at his usual time, 10:40, and held out the envelope without saying anything. He'd seen my name on the return address line. He knew what certified mail from a courthouse looked like. I signed the green card, thanked him, and waited until he reached the sidewalk before I opened it. The envelope was from Franklin County Courthouse. The petition inside was 11 pages, single-spaced, with Preston Whitfield listed as petitioner and my name, Martin James Calloway, listed as the subject of a proposed conservatorship. The language was precise in the way that legal language is precise when someone has spent money on it. It stated that I had demonstrated a pattern of cognitive decline consistent with diminished capacity to manage assets valued in excess of $500,000, and that the interests of said assets, including the property at 4 Aldermore Lane, required court-supervised oversight pending a formal competency determination. I read it once standing on the front porch. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and read it again. They had engaged a neuropsychiatric consultant, a Dr. Raymond Holt, whose credentials were listed in the appendix with the kind of thoroughness that is meant to be intimidating. His evaluation, according to the petition, was based on a collateral history provided by Gloria Whitfield, who had reported that I frequently failed to recognize acquaintances, repeated the same stories within single conversations, and on multiple occasions could not recall the names of individuals I had known for years. The petition noted that Dr. Holt had not conducted a direct examination. It noted this in a subordinate clause, briefly, as though it were a procedural detail rather than the entire foundation of the claim. I set the papers down and looked at the yellow legal pad on the corner of the table. I had been keeping notes for 11 weeks, dates, names, conversations, observations. Every entry was dated. Every name was spelled correctly. Every detail was specific. I had not missed a single week. I thought about Gloria Whitfield sitting in a room somewhere, describing my supposed confusion to a doctor she'd hired, and I thought about the 11 weeks of handwritten notes and the 14 months of documented preparation in the folder in my desk, and the fact that I had just read an 11-page legal petition and retained every material detail on the first pass. I folded the petition along its original crease and put it back in the envelope. Then I called Diane. She picked up before the second ring. I told her the petition had arrived. She asked if I'd read it. I told her I had. She asked about the conservatorship language. I told her about Dr. Holt and the collateral history from Gloria. There was a brief silence on her end, not surprise. I knew, but the particular pause of someone confirming what they had already expected. She said she would call me back within the hour. She called back in 40 minutes. Gloria came 3 days later. She arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, which I noted because I had been expecting her. She came alone this time. No folder, no documents, no legal backing. She was wearing a cream-colored jacket and the particular expression of someone who believes they are being merciful. I opened the door before she knocked. She stood on the porch and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. Then she said, "Martin, I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that much." I waited. She said, "You don't have a lawyer who can match what Preston has. You don't have the resources to sustain a prolonged court process, and the people who might have stood beside you well." She paused there, as though allowing me to fill in what she meant. "This doesn't have to be ugly. You sign the conservatorship agreement. You maintain your residence here, and everything continues as it has. You'd still be in your home. You'd still have your routines. You just wouldn't be carrying the administrative burden alone." She said the word burden the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. I looked at her. I had known Gloria Whitfield for 6 years, since Nora first brought Preston home for Thanksgiving, and Gloria had spent most of that dinner asking questions about the property values in our neighborhood. I had watched her operate for 6 years, the careful language, the reasonable tone, the way she positioned every acquisition as a kindness to someone. She was very good at it. I could see why it had worked as often as it had. I said, "Thank you for coming by, Gloria." That was all I said. She waited a moment, as though expecting more. When nothing came, her expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the kind that happens when a conversation doesn't follow the expected path. She said, Martin said, and I said, "I'll see you out." I held the door. She left. I watched her walk to her car, and then I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house was very quiet. It was always quiet at this hour, the particular afternoon quiet of a house that was built in 1987 and had settled into its own sounds over the years. The furnace, the floorboard outside the bathroom, the way the kitchen window frame expanded slightly in warm weather and caught the wind. Ruth had loved that sound. She said it meant the house was breathing. I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a while without turning on any lights. The photograph on the windowsill. Ruth at the back porch. The summer before her diagnosis, laughing at something I'd said that I could no longer remember, caught the afternoon light the way it always did at this hour. I didn't say anything out loud. I just looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you've looked at so many times that the looking itself has become a kind of conversation. Then I sat down, opened my legal pad, and wrote the date, the time, and Gloria Whitfield final visit. No documentation, verbal pressure, implied threat, legal resources. Below that I wrote offered continued residence in exchange for conservatorship signature. I underlined the last line. Then I stood up, walked to the desk in the study, and picked up the phone. Diane answered on the first ring this time. I said, "Are we ready?" She said, "We've been ready since last month." I told her I knew. I thanked her and hung up. I put the legal pad back on the table, squared it against the corner, and went to make coffee. Outside, the late afternoon had gone gray and still, the kind of stillness that comes before the weather changes. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the elm in the backyard, the one Ruth had planted the year we moved in, the one that was now taller than the roofline, and I thought about the 11 pages in the envelope on the table, and the folder in my desk, and the 14 months of preparation that Gloria Whitfield had no idea existed. The coffee finished. I poured a cup and drank it while it was still hot. Diane called me on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after Preston had filed. She had requested the full discovery package, every document Preston's team had submitted to the court, and she had gone through it the way I used to go through structural assessments, page by page, looking for what didn't belong. She found it on page 31. "There's a letter of authorization in here," she said, "dated 14 months ago. It authorizes Preston Whitfield to commission a professional appraisal of the Millbrook Road property on your behalf. It carries your signature, Martin, your full name, your address, your notarization stamp." I was quiet for a moment. I've never signed anything like that. "I know," Diane said. "That's why I'm calling." She sent it to Patricia Huang that afternoon. Patricia ran the notary office on High Street, had run it for 28 years. The same office where Ruth and I had signed the original deed on Millbrook Road in 1989, the same office where I had updated my estate documents twice since Ruth died. Patricia knew my signature the way a surgeon knows a patient's chart. She had processed more of my paperwork than any attorney I'd ever hired. She called back in 46 hours. I was at my desk when Diane patched her through. Patricia's voice was measured and precise, the voice of someone who had spent nearly 3 decades being careful with language because language, in her profession, was the difference between valid and void. She said, "The signature on this document does not match any signature Mr. Calloway has produced at this office in 19 years. The angle of inclination is different. The pen pressure is different, lighter on the downstrokes, heavier on the cross. And there is a more significant problem." She paused. "The notary seal on this document is not ours, but it carries our registration number." Diane said, "Patricia, are you willing to put that in writing?" "I've already drafted the report," Patricia said, "and I'm willing to testify." I wrote down what she said, all of it. I wrote it on the same legal pad I'd been using since the first week Diane and I had started preparing, the one with 14 months of notes in my handwriting, dates, amounts, names, observations. I wrote Patricia's words slowly, the way I used to annotate load-bearing calculations, because some things need to be recorded exactly as they were said. Diane filed the response the following Thursday. She attached Patricia's written report, flagged the registration number discrepancy, and submitted a formal request for document fraud investigation. She also attached something else, something I had prepared quietly, without telling anyone except Diane. It was a statement of account, 31 months of activity in a technical consulting account I had maintained since 2019, the one I had built up from contract work after Ruth died. the one I had never mentioned to Preston or Gloria because they had never asked and I had never offered. The balance was $340,000. The account showed regular activity deposits, transfers, reinvestments, the kind of activity that does not belong to a man whose cognitive capacity is, as Preston's filing had stated, progressively diminished and insufficient for independent financial management. I had read that phrase 11 times since the filing arrived. I had not responded to it. I had simply waited for the right moment to let someone else respond on my behalf. Diane called it the cleanest counter-evidence she'd seen in 14 years of practice. I told her I'd had time to prepare. Nora called me that Friday evening, just after 7. I was in the kitchen. The elm in the backyard had gone dark against the last of the light, and I was standing at the window the way I sometimes do when I need to think without thinking, just watching the tree, listening to the house settle. Her voice was different this time. It wasn't the careful, flattened voice she'd used in the months since Preston had filed, the voice that sounded like she was reading from something someone else had written. This was her actual voice, the one I recognized from before all of this, from the years before Preston, from the girl who used to sit on the porch steps and ask me questions about how bridges held weight. She said, "Dad, I didn't know about that document." I believed her. That was the hardest part of the whole thing. Not the forged signature, not the stolen registration number, not the 14 months of preparation. The hardest part was standing in my kitchen on a Friday evening, hearing my daughter's voice break on 6 words, and believing her completely. Because believing her meant understanding what had been done to her too, that she had been kept close enough to be useful and far enough from the truth to stay compliant. I said, "I know, Nora, I know you didn't." She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now Diane does her job," I said, "and we talk. But not tonight. When you're ready." She said okay. She said it quietly, like someone who had just been handed something she wasn't sure she deserved to hold. After we hung up, I stood at the window a while longer. The elm was just a shape now, dark against a darker sky. Ruth had chosen that tree from a nursery catalog in the spring of 1989, had pointed to the photograph, and said she wanted something that would outlast the house. I had told her that was a long time to plan for. She had said that was the point. I turned off the kitchen light and went to my desk. The legal pad was there, and the folder, and the statement of account I'd printed for Diane. I picked up a pen, found the last line I'd written Patricia's words, exact, and added the date. Then I closed the folder and left it where it was. The morning of the hearing, I woke at 4:47 and didn't go back to sleep. I made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter, and watched the elm tree come back into shape as the sky lightened. Ruth's tree, 35 years old now, taller than the roofline. I had measured it once not for any reason, just because I was a man who measured things. I showered, dressed in the gray suit I'd worn to 3 contract arbitrations and 1 funeral, and drove to the Franklin County Courthouse by way of Millbrook Road. Not because it was faster, it wasn't. But the house was on the way if you chose to go that way, and I chose to go that way. I slowed down when I passed it. The maple Ruth had planted the year Nora was born had gone orange at the edges. I had trimmed the lower branches 2 weeks ago. The yard was clean. Whatever happened in the next 3 hours, the yard was clean. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:22. Diane was already in the hallway outside courtroom 4B, standing with her briefcase on the floor beside her and a coffee in each hand. She handed one to me without being asked. She had known me long enough to know I would have already had 1 cup and would want another. "Ames filed a supplemental brief last night," she said. 10 pages. I read it at 6 this morning. There's nothing in it that changes anything. I asked if she was certain. She said, "I've been doing this for 23 years. I'm certain." We didn't say much after that. The hallway filled slowly clerks, other attorneys, a young woman with a stroller who had the wrong floor and left again. A bailiff came out of 4B and propped the door. His badge said, Kowalski. He was a broad man in his 50s with a deliberate way of moving, The kind of man who had learned not to hurry in spaces where hurrying made things worse. He looked at me once, nodded, and went back inside. At 9:08, Preston arrived with Richard Ames. I recognized Ames from the county bar directory I had pulled it 11 weeks ago when I first started the legal pad. Preston was in a dark suit and a tie I had seen before at Nora's birthday dinner 2 years ago. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He didn't look at me when he passed. Ames looked at me briefly, the way attorneys look at the opposing party, measuring, professional, already composing something. 2 minutes later, Gloria came in from the elevator, cream blazer, pearl earrings. She walked like a woman who had already decided how the morning would end. Nora was last. She came in at 9:13 alone and sat in the third row of the gallery without looking at anyone. She was wearing a coat she had owned since before she married Preston. I recognized it because I had been with her when she bought it, a Saturday in November, the year Ruth was first diagnosed. She sat very still with her hands in her lap. I went inside and sat at the respondents' table. Diane arranged the folders in front of us, 3 of them, tabbed and ordered. The one on the right was thicker than anything Preston's side had filed. I had watched Diane build it over 4 months. I knew what was in it. I knew the order of every tab. Judge Harlan Voss entered at 9:15 exactly. 22 years on the family court bench. I had read his published opinions, not all of them, but enough to understand how he thought. He was a man who did not enjoy having his time wasted, and who had a particular patience for complexity that was not the same thing as tolerance for dishonesty. He sat, put on his reading glasses, and opened Preston's filing without looking at anyone. The room was quiet. I counted the ceiling tiles out of habit. There were 16. Judge Voss read for 6 minutes. Then he opened Diane's response. He read that for longer, 8 minutes, maybe 9. He turned pages carefully, the way a man reads something he intends to remember. At one point he stopped, went back 2 pages, and read a section again. I watched his face. Nothing changed in it. Then he opened the third document, Patricia Huang's notarial report, and read it to the end. He took off his glasses. He set them on the bench. He looked at Preston. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "document 7 in your filing. The letter of authorization dated March 14th. He paused. "Patricia Huang, a notary public with 28 years of practice in this county, has submitted a sworn statement that the signature and seal on that document are not hers. She states she has never processed a document with that authorization number. She has provided her actual seal impression for comparison." He set the page down flat. "Do you have an explanation?" Preston turned to Ames. Ames leaned in and wrote something on a yellow pad. Whatever it said, Preston read it and straightened in his chair. "Your Honor," Preston said, "there may have been a version discrepancy in the document preparation. My office handles a significant volume." "This is not a version discrepancy," Judge Voss said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "A version discrepancy is a date error or a missing exhibit number. What Ms. Huang describes is a fabricated seal on a document submitted to this court as authentic evidence. That is forgery, Mr. Whitfield." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Ames put down his pen. He didn't pick it up again. Then he pushed back his chair just an inch, just enough, and the leather portfolio on Preston's side of the table slid forward as Preston's hand came off it. Preston caught it before it fell. But the motion was wrong. Too fast. The motion of a man who had stopped thinking about how he looked. He set the portfolio flat and put both hands on top of it and did not move them again. Diane stood. She said, "Your Honor, if I may." And Judge Voss nodded. She walked to the clerk's table and set down the second folder, the thick one. The clerk, a woman named Teresa, who had been in the room since before the session opened, looked at the folder, looked at Diane, and began logging it without being told. The respondent submits account records for a jointly held trust instrument established in 2019, Diane said. 14 months of transaction history, $340,000 in withdrawals the respondent was not informed of and did not authorize. We also submit 11 weeks of contemporaneous records documenting contact between Gloria Whitfield and members of the respondent's professional and social community records kept by the respondent himself. Judge Voss reached for the folder. He opened it to the first tab and read the top page. Then he looked up, and for the first time since the session had begun, he looked directly at me. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "how long did you keep these records?" 11 weeks, Your Honor, I said. He looked at me for a moment, not the way a judge looks at a party, the way a man looks at another man when he is calculating something. "I see," he said. He turned back to Preston. Preston was very still now. The leather portfolio was closed in front of him, and his hands were flat on either side of it. "The petition is denied," Judge Voss said. "The competency claim is dismissed with prejudice. The court finds no factual or legal basis for the relief requested." He closed the folder. "The matter of Document 7 is referred to the prosecutor's office. I will sign the referral order this afternoon. Mr. Ames, I expect you understand what that means for your client." Ames said, "Yes, Your Honor." Preston said nothing. From the gallery, Gloria said, "Your Honor, Martin Calloway has—" She didn't finish the sentence. Bailiff Kowalski was already moving. He stepped into the aisle and stood at the end of her row. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough, the particular stillness of a large man who has been in rooms like this for a long time and knows exactly how much force a situation requires. Judge Voss did not look up from the bench. He said, "Sit down." Gloria sat down. I had watched her for 22 months. I had watched her walk into rooms and rearrange them by the force of her certainty. I had watched her speak over people at dinner tables and in doorways and on the phone. I had watched her tell my daughter, in a voice calibrated to sound like concern, that her father was a man of limited means and diminishing relevance, that the kindest thing was to plan accordingly. This was the first time I had seen her do what someone else told her to do. I did not look at her for long. I turned back to the bench, where Judge Voss was writing something in his own hand at the top of a form. The courtroom had the particular silence of a room where something has just been decided and everyone is still absorbing what it means. Teresa at the clerk's table was entering information into her terminal, her fingers moving quickly and without expression. Ames was speaking quietly into Preston's ear. Preston was not responding. I looked once at the third row of the gallery. Nora was still sitting with her hands in her lap. She was looking at the bench, not at Preston, not at Gloria. Her face was the face of someone who has just heard something they had suspected for a long time and had hoped, until this moment, that they were wrong about. I turned back to face the front of the room. Diane set her hand briefly on the table beside my forearm, not touching, just near. It was a gesture I recognized. It meant we're done here. Judge Voss set down his pen. He said, "We're adjourned," and stood. The room began to move. Preston left without looking at me. He walked through the gate in the low wooden rail that separated the gallery from the well of the court, and he kept walking. His pace was measured, not hurried, but not slow either. The pace of a man trying to look like he had somewhere to be. Ames peeled off at the side door before reaching the main exit, briefcase in hand, already on his phone. I watched him go. Neither of them said anything to me. Neither of them said anything at all. Gloria was the last of the three to move. She gathered her bag from the seat beside her, a large structured thing in dark leather that she had set down at the start of the proceedings with the deliberateness of someone who expected to be staying a while. She stood. She straightened her jacket. She moved along the row toward the aisle, and as she passed the second row, then the first, I watched her hands. The bag strap was looped over her right wrist. Her fingers were wrapped around the top clasp. Her knuckles were not quite white, but close. The bag swung once as she stepped into the aisle. She did not look at me. She did not look at Diane, or at the clerk's table, or at the bench where Judge Voss had been sitting. She looked at the door at the far end of the room, and she walked toward it, and she pushed it open, and she was gone. Nora was still in the third row. I walked to the clerk's table. The young man there, Theo, his nameplate said, Theo Garland had been present for the entire proceeding. He had the kind of stillness that comes from sitting through long days in small rooms, and he handled the final transfer documents without ceremony, setting them in front of me, one at a time, indicating each signature line with a brief gesture. I signed where indicated. The pen was a standard ballpoint, the kind that costs nothing and works perfectly. When I had signed the last page, Theo collected the documents, aligned the edges, and set my copy on the table facing me. He said, "Have a good afternoon, sir." I told him I intended to. I picked up my copy and turned around. Nora was walking toward me from the gallery. She had her coat over her arm and her purse in her hand, and she was moving the way people move when they have made a decision and are not yet sure it was the right one. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red at the rims, and there was a quality to her face, a kind of stripped-down stillness that I hadn't seen since the week her mother died. She stopped about 3 feet from me. She said, "Dad, I didn't know about that document. I swear to you, I didn't know." I looked at her, 38 years old, standing in a courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, in the building on Front Street, where I had filed 2 contracts and 1 will amendment in the past 4 years, in the room where her husband had just been found to have submitted a document bearing a version of my signature that I had never produced. Her eyes were steady, even though they were wet. That steadiness that was Ruth. That had always been Ruth. I said, "I believe you." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the first tear came down, and then she was crying in earnest, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way adults cry when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally run out of reasons to keep holding it. I did not move toward her immediately. I stood where I was and let her cry. She needed to find the bottom of it herself. I had learned that much in 34 years of being her father, that there are things you cannot shorten for someone, no matter how much you want to. Some reckonings have their own pace, and the kindest thing you can do is not interrupt them. After a while, she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She said, "I kept telling myself he was under pressure, that the business was hard, that he wasn't." She stopped. She looked at the floor. I kept finding reasons. I said, "I know." She looked up. "You knew what he was doing." "I knew enough," I said. "Not all of it. Enough." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing with you, but are agreeing with something inside themselves. We stood there in the emptying room. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Someone in the hallway was talking on a phone, the voice muffled through the door. Diane found me in the corridor outside. She had her briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was moving with the efficient calm of someone who had already begun the next phase before the current one had fully closed. She stopped when she reached me, glanced briefly at Nora, and then looked at me. She said, "The prosecutor's office will be in contact within 5 business days. Preston is looking at charges for forgery of a legal instrument and asset fraud. Under Ohio statute, that carries 1 to 5 years, depending on how the DA assesses the scope." She paused. "He may negotiate, but the documentation Patricia flagged is clean. There's no ambiguity in the record." I said, "What about Nora?" Diane said, "There is no evidence she had knowledge of the falsified document. I will make certain that is stated explicitly in the supplemental filing. It will be part of the record." She looked at me steadily. "She is not exposed." I said, "Thank you, Diane." She said, "I'll call you Thursday," and walked toward the elevator. I stood in the corridor with my copy of the transfer documents in one hand. Nora was beside me. The building hummed around us, other rooms, other proceedings, other people in the middle of things they had not planned for. I had been in this building 3 times now, the first time with Ruth, the second time alone, and this time with a daughter who was learning, in the particular way that adult children sometimes learn, that the parent they had underestimated had been paying attention the whole time. Nora said, "Where do we go from here?" I said, "Home first, then we talk." She nodded. She put her coat on. I held the door at the end of the corridor, and she walked through. and I followed her out into the afternoon. 6 weeks after the hearing, Preston Whitfield was formally charged with forgery and property fraud in Franklin County. The indictment listed 4 counts. Diane called me the morning it was filed, before it appeared in the public record, because she had been watching the docket since the day we left the courthouse. She didn't say much. She said, "It's done." And I said, "Thank you." And we both understood that was the end of a long conversation that had started 14 months ago in her office on a Tuesday afternoon when I'd brought her a box of documents and a question she'd said she'd never been asked quite that way before. Ames withdrew from the case 2 days later. I read that in the county filing system, which I had learned to navigate during the months when I had nothing to do in the evenings but prepare. The withdrawal was filed without comment. That was the professional version of a door closing quietly. Gloria Whitfield did not call. She did not write. She did not appear at Nora's door or mine. The last time I had seen her was in that courtroom, standing very still while Judge Voss read from the second document, and I did not expect to see her again soon. Some people, when they lose, go somewhere quiet and stay there. I had known enough of them in my career to recognize the type. Carol Estes called on a Thursday evening. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and when I saw her name on the screen, I picked up immediately. She said she'd heard something from the church group. Dolores Fenn had mentioned it, and then someone else had confirmed it from the county news, and she wanted to know if I was all right. I told her I was. She said, "Martin, I've been your neighbor for 19 years, and I've never once seen you ask for help." I told her that was probably true. She said, "You should come to dinner sometime. I make a decent pot roast." I told her I'd take her up on that. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the cold tea. It occurred to me that Carol had called me the day she saw a stranger photographing my house, and she had called me now. She had been paying attention the whole time, too. Nora came on a Saturday morning, 8 days after Carol's call. I heard the car in the driveway, her old Civic, which she'd kept even after Preston had suggested more than once that she trade it in, and I was already standing when she knocked. She had 2 cups from the coffee shop on Otterbein Avenue, the one she used to stop at on her way to visit her mother. She held one out to me without saying anything, and I took it, and we went to the kitchen. We sat at the table where we had always sat. 4 chairs. The one on the left still had a pencil mark on the back rail from when Nora was in 3rd grade and had been doing homework while I read the paper. Ruth had never sanded it off. She said it was proof that the table had been used. I had never sanded it either. Nora wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the surface of the table for a while before she spoke. She said she had believed Preston because he told her I was declining. That was the word he'd used, declining, and she said she hadn't known what he meant exactly, but the way he said it made her afraid to ask. He had shown her documents. He had introduced her to a financial advisor she had never met before, a man who spoke very quickly and used terms she didn't recognize. And by the end of that meeting, she had signed something she hadn't fully read. She said she had told herself that Preston was handling it, that he understood these things better than she did, that it was easier to let him manage it. She stopped. She looked up. I didn't say I knew. I didn't say I had told her. I had thought both of those things at various points over the past 14 months. But sitting across from her at that table, with the coffee from Otterbein, and the pencil mark on the chair, and the apple tree outside the window that Ruth had planted in the spring of 1994, I found that I didn't want to say either of them. What I wanted was to hear her finish. She said, "I was scared. Dad, I thought something was wrong with you, and I didn't ask. I just let him tell me what to think." I said, "I understand why you believed him." She looked at me. Her face was the face she'd had at 7 years old when she wasn't sure if she was in trouble. She said, "You're not angry at me." I said, "I'm angry at Preston. I'm not angry at you." She picked up her cup. She drank. Outside, the apple tree was in bloom, small white flowers, the kind that only lasted about 2 weeks, and that Ruth had always made a point of looking at before they fell. I had looked at them every year since she died. This was the first year I had someone to look at them with. We didn't talk for a while after that. We didn't need to. The kitchen was quiet in the way it used to be quiet on Saturday mornings when Nora was young and the week hadn't started yet, and there was nothing that needed deciding right away. That evening, after Nora had gone, I sat at the table alone. The cups were in the sink. The light outside had gone from afternoon gold to the flat gray that comes just before dark, and I hadn't turned the lamp on yet. I sat in that half light, and I thought about what Gloria Whitfield had said to me. In this same room, 2 years ago, she had stood near the counter, not sitting, never sitting, as though sitting would have conceded too much, and she had said, very clearly, that I had nothing left to give this family. She had said it the way people say things they believe completely, without cruelty and without hesitation, the way you state a fact. I thought about the 11 weeks of records, the 14 months of preparation, the account at Mercantile Federal that held $340,000, which no one had known about because no one had asked. I thought about Patricia Huang reading those documents and setting them down and saying what she said. I thought about Judge Voss and the particular way he had looked at Preston over the rim of his glasses. The way a man looks when he has seen every version of a thing and is no longer surprised, but is still, quietly, disappointed. I thought about Diane saying, "It's done." And then I thought about Nora at this table, the coffee from Otterbein, the pencil mark, her face when she said she hadn't asked. That was the thing Gloria had gotten wrong. Not the money, not the documents, not the account or the legal strategy or any of the specific, measurable things that had been arranged and prepared and finally presented in a courtroom on a Thursday in March. Those had mattered, but they were not what I had been protecting. I stood up. I turned off the light. I went to bed. The apple tree was still blooming in the dark outside. 18 months after the hearing, Preston Whitfield entered a guilty plea on 2 counts of document fraud. The judge who presided over that proceeding was not Judge Voss. It was a different courtroom, a different Thursday, and I was not there. Diane called me afterward. She said the sentencing had taken 40 minutes and that Preston had said nothing when the judge read the terms. His law license was suspended for 3 years. The fine was $85,000. His firm let him go the same afternoon. Gloria Whitfield did not return to First Methodist after the hearing. Carol told me this in October, matter-of-factly, the way she reported most things she had heard it from Dolores Fenn, who had heard it from the women in the fellowship hall that Gloria had spent 2 years cultivating. The story about my memory issues had made its way back to them by then, and the particular thing about that kind of story is that it reverses badly. The women who had nodded along and felt concerned were now the women who had been misled, and they did not forget that. Margaret Osei called me in September the first time in almost a year. She said she owed me an apology. I told her she didn't. She said she did anyway, and she gave it, and I accepted it, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, which was exactly what I had wanted. Gloria's name appeared once more in the county business filings in November on a dissolution notice for a financial consulting practice she had operated out of Bexley for 11 years. I read it in the public record and did not follow up. 4 months after the hearing, she moved to Cincinnati, where her daughter lived. I did not know what she told her when she arrived. I did not ask. Nora filed for divorce in July. Diane did not represent her, but she made a call on Nora's behalf to a family law attorney named Sandra Reyes, who had an office on the east side of town and a reputation for being thorough. I know this because Nora told me herself. On a Saturday morning in August, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, she said Sandra was good. I said I was glad. We didn't say anything else about it for a long time. She started coming on Saturdays sometime in May. A few weeks after the hearing, the first time, she stayed 40 minutes. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 4 chairs at the table and said, "I remember when that chair had a pencil mark on it." I said it still did. She sat down and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she asked if I wanted coffee. I said I already had some. She made herself a cup anyway. After that, she came most Saturdays, sometimes an hour, sometimes the whole morning. We did not talk much about Preston. We did not talk much about Gloria. We talked about Ruth, small things, specific things, the way she had kept the kitchen or the particular angle of light through the back window in October. We talked about the house. We talked about the apple tree, which had come back fuller than it had been in years, and which Nora said she had always loved and never told me. One morning in April, she asked if I was thinking about planting anything else in the back garden. I said I'd think about it. She nodded and looked out of the window. The tree was just beginning to bloom. I told her Ruth had wanted to plant a second one, a different variety, something that fruited later in the season so they wouldn't all come at once. Nora said that sounded right. I said maybe this fall. She said she'd help if I wanted. I said I'd let her know. The account at First Meridian still held $340,000. I had not touched it. There had been a period, in the months after the hearing, when I had thought about what to do with it, whether to move it, whether to put it somewhere else, whether any of it needed to change. I decided it did not. The money had never been the point. It had only been the thing they believed was the point, which was not the same thing at all. I was still at Millbrook Road, the house Ruth and I had built in 1989, the year after we were married, on a lot that had been a field, and before that, according to the old county survey, a drainage easement no one had wanted. We had wanted it. We had cleared it ourselves over 2 weekends in September and broken ground in the spring. Ruth had chosen the kitchen layout. I had poured the foundation. The apple tree had been her idea, planted the third summer we were there, when the yard had finally settled enough to hold something permanent. I did not need to prove anything more. That was the thing that had taken me the longest to understand, not that I had won, but that the winning had only ever been a means to get back to something that had been mine the whole time. On an afternoon in May, Gerald stopped at the mailbox at the end of the drive. He had been on this route for 14 years, and he knew the house, and he knew me, and he knew, in the way that people who move through a neighborhood long enough come to know things, that the last 2 years had not been ordinary. He didn't say any of that. He stopped his truck and handed me the mail through the window and looked out at the yard where I was standing with the hose running over the base of the apple tree. He said, "Looking good, Mr. Calloway." I said, "I'm fine, Gerald." He nodded once and pulled back onto the road. I turned back to the tree and kept watering. If you've ever been told you had nothing left to give, and then spent 2 quiet years proving that the only thing that mattered was still standing, you already understand why some victories don't need to be announced. If stories like this one find you at the right moment, consider subscribing, because there are more of them, and they're all waiting.